Can a company overthrow a government? And can a fruit company become more powerful than a sovereign nation? It sounds like the plot of a political thriller, but for much of the 20th century, that was reality across parts of Latin America. There was a time when the fate of entire nations wasn't decided in parliament buildings or presidential palaces. It was decided in corporate boardrooms. And at the center of this story wasn't an oil giant, a military contractor, or a tech company. It was a banana company. Its name was the United Fruit Company. Empires usually arrive under a flag. United Fruit arrived under a logo, and in its wake, it left behind coups, civil wars, and one of the most controversial corporate legacies in modern history. Today, when we think of powerful corporations, we think of companies like Apple, Google, or Amazon. But a century ago, one of the most influential corporations on Earth sold bananas. To understand how this happened, we need to go back to the late 19th century. At the time, bananas were considered an exotic luxury in the United States and Europe. They were sweet, cheap, and consumers couldn't get enough of them. But bananas had one major problem. They spoiled quickly, very quickly. Once harvested, a banana had only a short window to be transported, cooled, shipped across oceans, unloaded, and delivered to customers before it became worthless. This meant banana companies needed much more than farmland. They needed ports, railroads, warehouses, refrigerated ships, and most importantly, governments that would stay out of their way. In 1899, the United Fruit Company was formed, and over the following decades, it built an empire unlike anything the world had seen before. The company didn't just grow bananas. It owned massive shipping fleets, built railroads, controlled ports, purchased millions of acres of land, and in some countries became more influential than the governments themselves. In Costa Rica, Honduras, and Guatemala, United Fruit wasn't simply a corporation. It was a landowner, a transportation monopoly, a political actor, and an economic powerhouse. As the company expanded, a new term entered the political vocabulary. In 1904, American writer O. Henry spent time in Honduras and observed something unusual. The country appeared independent on paper, but much of its economy revolved around a single export. Political decisions were heavily influenced by foreign interests, and national institutions seemed vulnerable to outside pressure. To describe this system, O. Henry coined a phrase that would survive for more than a century: Banana Republic. The term wasn't originally a joke, it was a warning. A banana republic was a country whose economy depended on a single export, where political power could be influenced from abroad, and where sovereignty existed only to a certain extent. As United Fruit grew, more and more countries fit that description. Over the years, the company acquired millions of acres of land across Central America. But it wasn't just buying land, it was buying influence. Many workers lived in company towns. The houses belonged to the company, the schools belonged to the company, the hospitals belonged to the company, and in some cases, workers weren't even paid in cash. Instead, they received company-issued vouchers that could only be spent in company-owned stores. The company paid your wages, rented you a house, sold you your food, and ultimately the money flowed right back into company hands. The entire economic cycle was controlled by a single corporation. Even the railroads revealed the company's priorities. If you look at old railway maps across Central America today, you'll notice something strange. Many of the lines don't connect major cities. They don't serve population centers. Instead, they run directly from plantations to ports. Because they weren't built for people, they were built for bananas. And over time, United Fruit discovered that its greatest source of power wasn't land. It was politics. The company supported politicians who offered tax breaks, funded campaigns, lobbied governments, and aligned itself with leaders willing to suppress labor movements. But its most powerful ally wasn't a politician. It was the United States government. Throughout much of the 20th century, Washington viewed the protection of American business interests abroad as a strategic priority. As a result, labor strikes could suddenly become communist threats. Tax increases could become a tax on American interests. Land reforms could be portrayed as threats to private property. Eventually, the line between corporate interests and national interests began to blur. Then came Guatemala. In 1951, a new president took office, Jacobo Árbenz. He inherited a country plagued by extreme inequality. Most of the population lived in poverty, yet a tiny percentage of landowners controlled the vast majority of the country's fertile land. Much of that land belonged to United Fruit Company, and a significant portion of it sat unused. Árbenz believed this was a national problem, so he introduced a land reform program. Unused land would be expropriated, and landowners would be compensated. But there was a catch. Compensation would be based on the value that landowners themselves had reported for tax purposes. At first glance, it seemed fair. But for United Fruit, it was a disaster. For years, the company had undervalued its land to reduce taxes. Now, those same valuations were being used to determine compensation. Suddenly, land that had supposedly been worth very little became incredibly valuable. United Fruit was furious, and it turned to its powerful friends in Washington. At the time, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles had previously worked for a law firm connected to the company. CIA Director Allen Dulles also had ties to United Fruit. Meanwhile, the Cold War was intensifying, and before long, Árbenz was no longer being portrayed as a reformer. He was being portrayed as a communist threat. In 1954, the CIA launched Operation PBSUCCESS, a covert operation designed to remove him from power. Opposition forces were trained, propaganda campaigns were launched, false radio broadcasts spread panic, military officers were bribed, and an illusion was created that a massive uprising was underway. Eventually, Árbenz resigned. The new government quickly reversed the land reforms. United Fruit's interests were protected, but Guatemala paid a far heavier price. The country descended into decades of violence and civil conflict. Historians estimate that more than 200,000 people would eventually lose their lives. At the height of its power, United Fruit earned a nickname across Latin America, El Pulpo, the octopus, because its tentacles seemed to reach everywhere, into ports, into railroads, into newspapers, into politics, into labor markets, and even into foreign governments. Some historians have noted that the company owned more ships than several Latin American navies. For a corporation, that is a remarkable level of influence. But this story isn't really about bananas. It's about power. It's about what happens when economic influence grows so large that it begins shaping politics. When a corporation controls infrastructure, employment, trade, and access to capital, the sovereignty of a nation can become surprisingly fragile. Today, corporations don't overthrow governments the way they once did, at least not openly. But supply chains still shape policy. Financial leverage still influences decisions. Technology platforms still affect elections and public opinion. The tools have changed. The incentives have not. Because history teaches us something important. Governments change. Presidents come and go. Technologies evolve. But power always finds a new way to operate. And sometimes, an empire doesn't arrive with an army. Sometimes, it arrives with a banana.